Family demons made you strong, not safe. You didn't grow up in comfort. You grew up alert, listening for shifts in tone, reading silences more carefully than words, learning when to speak, when to disappear, when to become smaller so the moment could pass. What others call strength was never a gift handed to you. It was a reflex built in an environment where ease was rare and emotional safety was uncertain. You became resilient not because life encouraged you, but because life demanded it. You learned early that love could be unpredictable, that approval could change without warning, and that peace was something to be managed, not enjoyed. So you adapted, you sharpened your awareness, you carried responsibility before you had language for it. You grew capable, composed, and controlled, but never fully at rest. The strength people admire in you was shaped in pressure, not protection. It kept you standing, but it never allowed you to relax. This is the quiet truth few speak aloud. Being strong does not mean you were safe. It means you endured. It means you learned to function while holding your breath. It means you mastered survival so well that no one noticed the cost. And now, as the world calls you powerful, you stand at a turning point where strength no longer has to be your shield and awareness becomes the first step towards something greater than survival. This speech is not about blame. It is about clarity. It is about understanding how what shaped you also limited you, and how recognizing that truth is the beginning of reclaiming calm, dignity, and choice. Strength was learned in survival, not love. Strength did not enter your life gently. It did not arrive through reassurance, warmth, or steady guidance. It arrived through necessity, through moments where you realized that no one was coming to soften the impact, explain the confusion, or hold the emotional weight with you. You became strong because weakness was not an option afforded to you. You learned endurance before you learned ease. You learned control before you learned comfort. And over time, that endurance shaped your identity so completely that even you began to believe this was simply who you were rather than what you were forced to become. In an environment where emotional consistency was uncertain, survival required precision. You learned to watch closely, faces, pauses, shifts in energy. You understood before others spoke that something was wrong. You adjusted your behavior, your tone, your expectations, not because you wanted to, but because you had to. Love, when unpredictable, teaches vigilance. And vigilance, practiced long enough, becomes strength. Not the kind that rests confidently, but the kind that stands ready, alert, prepared for impact at any moment. This is a strength the world applauds without understanding. People admire your composure, your independence, your ability to remain calm under pressure. They call you mature, capable, resilient. What they do not see is that this strength was built in response to instability, not encouragement. It was learned in silence, in emotional self-management, in moments where expressing need felt risky or pointless. You did not grow strong because you were supported. You grew strong because support could not be assumed. There is a quiet loneliness in this kind of strength, because when survival shapes you, connection becomes conditional. You learn to rely on yourself first, not as a preference, but as a rule. Trust is measured. Vulnerability is rationed. You share only what feels safe to lose. Even in calm moments, part of you remains watchful, as if peace might suddenly demand payment. This is not pessimism, it is training. Training received too early, for too long. Strength learned through survival often confuses endurance with identity. You begin to believe that being strong means never needing, never resting, never leaning too heavily on anyone else. You confuse self-control with self-worth. You pride yourself on how much you can carry without complaint. But inside, there is fatigue that does not leave with sleep, and tension that does not dissolve even in quiet moments, because the body remembers what the mind normalized. It is important to say this clearly. Strength built without safety always comes at a cost. It keeps you functional, but it keeps you guarded. It allows achievement, but limits ease. It produces capability, but delays peace. You were never taught how to feel secure. You were taught how to cope. And coping, while powerful, is not the same as being held, understood, or emotionally grounded. Yet this keynote is not a dismissal of your strength. It is a reframing of it. because the fact that you survived without consistent safety speaks to an extraordinary internal intelligence. You adapted, you learned, you protected yourself the only way you knew how. That strength deserves respect, but it also deserves rest. The mistake is not that you became strong. The mistake is believing that strength must always come from tension. Understanding this distinction changes everything. When you recognize that your strength was forged in survival, you stop romanticizing the conditions that created it. You stop minimizing what you endured. You allow yourself to acknowledge that something essential was missing, and that missing piece was not discipline, resilience, or character. It was emotional safety. And naming that absence is not weakness, it is awareness. Awareness is the moment strength evolves. It is where survival gives way to choice, where you begin to ask not just, can I handle this, but do I need to? Where you allow yourself to build a different kind of strength, one that does not require constant alertness, one that does not equate calm with danger, one that permits softness without fear. This keynote stands as a truth many carry but few articulate. You were shaped by endurance, not nurtured by security. And while that made you formidable, it does not have to define your future. Strength can remain, but it no longer has to come from bracing yourself against what might go wrong. It can come from learning what it feels like when nothing needs to be survived. Silence became a skill before voice became a choice. Silence did not begin as a preference, it began as a solution. Long before you understood language fully, you understood consequence. You learned that words could change the atmosphere of a room, that questions could create tension, that honesty, offered at the wrong moment, could cost you peace. So you adapted, not by speaking more clearly, but by speaking less. Silence became a form of intelligence, a way to stay unnoticed, a way to remain emotionally intact in spaces where expression was unpredictable. Over time, this silence sharpened into skill. You learned to listen more than you spoke, to observe before reacting, to measure the emotional temperature before offering your thoughts. You became someone who could sit in discomfort without drawing attention to it. Others mistook this for calmness, maturity, or wisdom, and in many ways it was. But it was also restraint learned under pressure, a discipline formed not through guidance, but through necessity. When safety is uncertain, voice feels risky. You begin to associate speaking with exposure and exposure with loss of control. So you wait, you filter, you soften truths until they are barely recognizable. You learn how to express just enough to remain acceptable, but never enough to become vulnerable. This is not dishonesty, it is self-preservation. Silence in this context is not emptiness, it is strategy. The cost of this strategy is subtle but profound. When silence becomes habitual, your inner world grows rich and complex but largely unseen. You carry thoughts, insights, and emotions that never find language. You become fluent in understanding others, yet uncertain in expressing yourself. And eventually, you forget that your voice was ever meant to be safe. You begin to believe it is something to be managed rather than trusted. This is how silence reshapes identity. You become reliable, steady, non-confrontational. You are praised for being easy to be around, for not creating conflict, for keeping things smooth. But beneath that praise lies a quiet erasure, because every unspoken need, every swallowed truth teaches you that your internal experience ranks lower than external harmony, and over time, that lesson settles deep. Silence, when learned too early, can make connection feel distant even in close relationships. You may be present, attentive, generous, but rarely fully revealed. You share selectively, often waiting to be asked, and even then, offering only fragments. Not because you lack depth, but because you learned that depth requires permission, and permission was rarely granted. Yet it is important to recognize the intelligence behind this silence. It protected you. It gave you space to think, to observe, to endure. It prevented unnecessary escalation. It kept you emotionally intact in environments that did not know how to handle honesty. This silence was not weakness. It was a form of strength refined through experience. But like all survival skills, it was never meant to be permanent. The shift begins when you realize that voice is not rebellion, it is presence. That speaking does not automatically invite danger, that your thoughts do not need to be perfect, timed, or filtered to deserve space. This realization can feel uncomfortable, even unsettling, because it challenges a lifetime of conditioning. But discomfort in this case is not a warning, it is a doorway. Reclaiming your voice does not mean becoming loud or confrontational. It means becoming honest with yourself first. It means noticing when silence is chosen freely and when it is chosen out of habit. It means allowing small truths to be spoken, even if they tremble at first. Because a voice that was once suppressed does not return fully formed. It returns gradually through practice and patience. This keynote is about honoring the silence that protected you without allowing it to confine you. It is about understanding that while silence once kept you safe enough to survive, it does not have to define how you live now. Your voice was delayed, not denied, and when you begin to use it, not as defense, but as expression, you step into a strength that no longer hides. Responsibility was forced too early. Responsibility did not arrive in your life as guidance or trust. It arrived as weight. Long before you were ready to carry it, long before you understood what it meant, you were placed in a position where awareness, restraint, and emotional management became expected of you. You learned quickly that someone had to remain composed, someone had to hold things together, someone had to anticipate what might go wrong before it did, and without ceremony or consent, that role became yours. When responsibility is forced too early, childhood quietly shortens. Curiosity gives way to caution. Playfulness yields to practicality. You become aware not only of your own emotions but of everyone else's as well. You monitor moods, anticipate reactions, and adjust yourself accordingly. This is not maturity, it is adaptation. And while it creates capability, it also creates a constant internal pressure to perform stability, even when you are uncertain inside. You were praised for being sensible, dependable, and understanding. Those words sounded like recognition, but they often masked an unspoken expectation that you would manage what others could not. You became the calm presence, the mediator, the one who didn't add to the tension. But no one asked whether you wanted this role or what it cost you to maintain it. Responsibility, when imposed rather than chosen, teaches you that your needs come second to keeping things functional. This early burden shapes how you view worth. You begin to associate value with usefulness. You feel most secure when you are needed, when you are solving, fixing, stabilizing. Rest feels unfamiliar. Ease feels undeserved. And asking for help feels like failure. Because somewhere along the way, you learned that being the strong one meant being the last to need support. The emotional consequences of this are rarely visible from the outside. You appear organized, capable, and self-controlled, but internally there is often fatigue that has no clear source, a sense of always being on, a difficulty relaxing fully, even in safe environments. Because when responsibility arrives too early, the nervous system never learns how to stand down. It remains prepared, vigilant, and braced. This early responsibility also shapes relationships. You may attract people who lean on you, who admire your strength, who rely on your steadiness. And while you give generously, part of you may feel unseen, because being needed is not the same as being known. When you are always the one holding space, there is little room left for your own uncertainty, your own softness, your own need to be held. It is important to say this clearly. Being responsible early was not a character flaw, nor was it a choice you made freely. It was a response to circumstances that required more from you than was fair, and acknowledging that truth does not diminish your strength. It contextualizes it. It allows you to see that what you carried was real, and that the cost of carrying it was significant. The turning point comes when responsibility shifts from obligation to choice. When you begin to ask not only what you can handle, but what you should. When you allow yourself to step back without guilt. When you recognize that your worth is not measured by how much you can carry for others, but by your right to exist without constant function. Learning to release early responsibility is not about abandoning care. It is about restoring balance. It is about allowing yourself to be supported without self-judgment. It is about recognizing that strength does not require perpetual readiness, that you can be dependable and still be human, that you can be capable and still need rest. This keynote stands as recognition of a truth many never voice. You grew up too fast because the environment demanded it. And while that made you competent beyond your years, it also deprived you of gentleness that should have been yours. The future does not require you to remain in that role. Responsibility can become something you choose, not something you carry simply because you always have. Independence was built from emotional distance. Independence did not emerge in your life as confidence or encouragement. It emerged as a conclusion, a quiet understanding formed over time that relying too deeply on others carried uncertainty, and that expecting emotional consistency was risky. So you learned to stand alone, not as an act of pride, but as an act of self-preservation. Independence became safer than hope, and distance became more reliable than reassurance. You did not stop needing connection. You stopped expecting it to arrive in a stable form. Emotional distance was not coldness, it was caution refined through experience. You learned how to manage your inner world privately, how to process disappointment without witnesses, how to recover quietly and continue forward without asking too many questions. This self-reliance was impressive, but it was also isolating, because when independence is built from distance, it keeps you capable, but not always connected. Over time, this distance reshaped how you relate to others. You became selective, measured, slow to depend. You offered support more easily than you accepted it. You were present, helpful, reliable, but rarely fully leaning in. Not because you lacked depth or care, but because you learned that closeness could blur boundaries and create vulnerability you did not know how to protect. So you maintained space, even when you wanted intimacy. This kind of independence often receives praise. People admire your strength, your self-sufficiency, your ability to handle life without complaint. They see someone who does not cling, who does not demand, who does not overwhelm. But what they do not see is the quiet discipline behind that independence, the constant regulation, the emotional restraint, the decision to absorb rather than express. Independence, in this form, is not freedom. It is control learned early. There is also a hidden grief in emotional distance. A grief for the ease you never experienced, for the comfort that felt inconsistent, for the moments when leaning in would have been natural but did not feel safe. You may not name this grief often because you learned to move forward without looking back, but it exists, shaping your relationships, your expectations, and your sense of belonging. Emotional distance can also create confusion in safe environments. When others offer support without conditions, you may feel uneasy rather than relieved. When care is consistent, part of you waits for it to change. You may minimize your needs, redirect attention, or retreat inward, not because something is wrong, but because familiarity with distance feels safer than learning a new emotional language. Yet it is important to recognize the intelligence behind this independence. It protected you when closeness felt unpredictable. It allowed you to function, to grow, to build a sense of self without relying on unstable foundations. This independence was not a failure of trust. It was a solution to its absence. And solutions deserve acknowledgement, not shame. The evolution begins when independence is no longer used to avoid connection, but to choose it wisely. When distance becomes an option, not a requirement. When you allow yourself to test closeness without abandoning self-protection. This is not about surrendering boundaries. It is about softening rigidity, about letting independence coexist with openness. True independence is not the absence of need, it is the freedom to express it without fear. It is the ability to stand alone without believing you must. And learning this takes time because it asks you to unlearn the idea that distance equals safety. It asks you to trust discernment instead of withdrawal, affirms a powerful truth. You became independent because you had to, not because you wanted to be alone. And while that independence served you well, it does not have to define how close you allow others to come. Distance protected you once, but connection, chosen carefully, can strengthen you now. Healing begins when strength is no longer used as armor. For a long time, strength was not something you carried, it was something you wore. It stood between you and uncertainty, between you and disappointment, between you and emotions that once felt overwhelming. Strength became your armor, polished by endurance and reinforced by habit. It kept you moving forward, kept you composed, kept you intact. But armor, no matter how effective, is not meant to be worn forever. When strength is used as armor, it serves a purpose. It absorbs impact. It prevents collapse. It allows you to function in environments where softness would have been costly. You learn to stay composed under pressure, to regulate yourself without guidance, to remain steady when steadiness was demanded of you. This strength was not performative, it was necessary, and for that, it deserves respect. But armor also restricts movement. It limits sensation. It creates distance between you and your own emotional experience. Over time, you may have noticed that while you could endure almost anything, you struggled to fully feel safety, joy, or rest. Because armor protects against pain, but it also blocks intimacy with others and with yourself. Healing does not begin by dismantling strength. It begins by understanding why it was needed, by acknowledging the environments that required you to be constantly prepared, by recognizing that your vigilance was logical, not excessive. This recognition is not about revisiting the past endlessly. It is about validating the reality that shaped you, so you no longer have to defend against it in the present. The shift happens when you realize that strength does not have to disappear for armor to be removed. Strength can remain, but it can change form. It can become discernment instead of defense, presence instead of performance, choice instead of reflex. This is a subtle but profound transformation because it allows you to stay capable without staying guarded. Letting go of armor can feel unsettling at first. Vulnerability, when unfamiliar, feels like exposure. Rest feels unproductive. Ease feels undeserved. You may find yourself instinctively tightening when things go well, waiting for disruption. But healing is not the absence of fear. It is the willingness to notice it without obeying it. It is learning to sit in moments of calm without preparing for their end. One of the most powerful signs of healing is the ability to soften without collapsing, to allow emotion without losing control, to accept support without guilt. These moments may feel small, even insignificant, but they mark a major internal shift. They signal that strength is no longer required to stand guard every second. Healing also involves redefining identity. When you have been strong for so long, strength becomes who you are, not just how you cope. Releasing armor can feel like losing yourself, but what you discover instead is expansion. Space for curiosity, space for rest, space for connection that does not demand constant self-monitoring. This does not mean you trust indiscriminately or abandon boundaries. Healing is not naivety. It is informed openness. You keep your awareness, your discernment, your capacity to protect yourself, but you no longer assume that every situation requires protection. You learn to assess rather than brace, to respond rather than prepare. The final truth of this: healing begins when strength stops being a shield and becomes a resource, when it supports you rather than confines you, when it allows you to engage with life instead of merely withstand it. You were never meant to live in survival mode forever. Strength carried you through, but healing invites you to finally put it down, not because you are weaker, but because you are no longer in danger.